in a small town where the hum of streetlights and the faint echo of tires on cracked pavement told the story of a place forgotten by most but endured by many. In this town lived a young black woman named Imani. She was 30 years old, and life had pressed her down in ways that were invisible to those who had never carried hunger in their stomach or prejudice on their back. For months, she had been working part-time hours at a laundromat, barely enough to keep the lights on in her apartment. Her shoes were worn, her clothes faded, but what weighed on her the most was the gnawing emptiness of hunger. Not just hers, but the worry of how she would get by tomorrow. On a humid summer afternoon, Imani walked into a neighborhood mart, the kind of place with flickering fluorescent bulbs and rows of cheap goods stacked with no real order. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. Her pride usually kept her from taking what wasn't hers, but that day, desperation clawed at her chest. She reached for a small packet of chips, just a bag worth $1. It was something small, something to put in her body so the dizziness of hunger would loosen its grip. She slipped the bag into her worn purse, hoping no one would notice. But someone did. Officer Daniel Moore was there that day, patrolling, as he often did, with an air of superiority that wasn't about safety, but control. He was a white police officer in his late 40s, known around the town not for his protection, but for his arrogance and the way his gaze lingered too long on the vulnerable. He carried himself like the law was his weapon, not his duty. When his eyes landed on Imani, all he saw was not a hungry woman, but a target, someone he could exert power over. The store clerk didn't even call for him. But Moore stepped forward anyway, puffing up with authority, shouting so that everyone could hear. "You think you can steal? You think you can take what ain't yours?" His voice cracked like a whip through the aisles. Imani froze, clutching her purse tight. She tried to explain, her voice trembling. "It's just food. I was hungry." But Moore wasn't listening. To him, her words were nothing more than excuses. He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her out into the open, dragging her as if she were a criminal who had committed some great crime. Outside, the sunlight glared harshly against the scene. A few people had stopped, watching from across the street. Some pulled out phones, others hesitated, unsure if they should intervene. Moore's anger boiled, not because of the chips, but because in his mind, her existence as a black woman taking something without his permission was an offense to his pride. He shoved her hard against the hood of his car. Her cries echoed, "Please, I didn't mean." But his fist silenced her. Blow after blow, each strike was more violent than the last, the metallic thud of his baton cracking the air. The crowd began to shout, some pleading for him to stop. But Moore's rage had no brakes. His boot pressed against her ribs, his fists against her face. By the time the ambulance was called, by the time her limp body was pulled away from the asphalt, the life had already drained from her. A bag of chips lay crumpled on the ground, stained with dirt. Imani was dead, killed not for violence, not for a crime, but for hunger. The town was shaken. News spread fast, igniting sorrow and fury. Her family, broken by grief, demanded answers. Her neighbors cried at vigils, candles burning late into the night, with chants of justice for Imani. But the system was slow, resistant. At first, Moore's department defended him, painting him as an officer doing his job, twisting the story as though Imani had resisted, as though her death was inevitable. Reports were filed, carefully worded to protect the badge, not the truth. But the videos told another story. Those who had pulled out their phones had captured everything: her pleas, his blows, her final collapse. The footage went viral, reaching beyond the borders of the town, sparking outrage across the country. Strangers who had never known Imani wept for her, and people marched in the streets demanding accountability. The chants grew louder. "Say her name, Imani." Murals began to appear on walls, painted with her face, her story becoming a symbol of struggle, of the cruelty of power unchecked. Moore, meanwhile, carried on as though he was untouchable. He strutted through town with the same arrogance, believing the system would shield him like it always had. But cracks began to form. His name became synonymous with violence. People he once intimidated began to stare back with contempt. Restaurants refused him service. Parents pulled their children away when he walked past. The shield of fear he had wielded began to erode. Inside his own home, the silence grew heavy. His wife, once loyal, was ashamed to be seen beside him. His children were taunted at school, labeled as the offspring of a murderer. The whispers followed him everywhere, Karma's quiet footsteps creeping closer. And at night, when he lay in bed, he could not escape the sound of her cries. They echoed in his head, over and over, "I was hungry." Sleep eluded him, and when it came, it was filled with visions of her face, bloodied and pleading, reaching for him in the dark. The trial that followed was long, filled with tension. Prosecutors played the footage for the jury, every blow replayed in agonizing detail. Imani's family sat in the front row, their grief raw but their determination unbroken. Moore's defense tried to twist the narrative, painting her as a threat, exaggerating every movement she had made in those final moments. But the world was watching, and the truth was undeniable. The jury returned with a verdict: guilty. The courtroom erupted, tears, cries of relief, shouts of triumph. For once, the system had not bent entirely in favor of the badge. Moore was sentenced to life behind bars, stripped of the uniform he had once used as armor. Yet even in prison, Karma did not let him rest. Other inmates knew who he was, knew what he had done. The very authority he once wielded now marked him as prey. He was harassed, beaten, isolated. The law had caged him, but Karma gnawed at him from within, piece by piece, day by day. Outside, Imani's name lived on. Her story was told in classrooms, in churches, in the streets. She became more than a victim. She became a reminder of resilience, of injustice met with resistance, of hunger that was met not with kindness, but with cruelty. Communities rallied to build food banks in her honor, ensuring that no one else would have to steal to eat. Scholarships were created in her name, her legacy feeding futures she would never see. Moore's downfall was not just his conviction, but the unraveling of the illusion of power he had clung to. He lost everything: his family, his reputation, his freedom. And in that loss, the balance was restored. Justice was not swift, and it did not erase the pain, but it came, carried on the voices of those who refused to be silent. In the end, the town was not the same. The streets still hummed with life, the store still stood where it always had, but something had shifted. The people stood taller, more united. They had seen what unchecked power could do, and they had also seen that it could be broken. And though Imani's body lay in the earth, her spirit lingered in every mural, every chant, every act of kindness done in her name. The bag of chips that had cost her life became a symbol, not of theft, not of crime, but of the cruelty of a world that could deny someone even the smallest relief of hunger. And in that symbol was a lesson carved deep. No life should ever be measured by its mistakes, and no authority should ever go unchallenged when it chooses cruelty over compassion. And so, the story of Imani did not end with her last breath on the pavement. It continued, in the fire of protests, in the ink of court documents, in the silence of Moore's prison cell, in the laughter of children who would never know her, but would benefit from her legacy. Karma had claimed its due, and justice, though delayed, had been served. If this story moved you, drop a comment sharing your thoughts or feelings. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of struggle, justice, and resilience, so Imani's story lives on. Share this video to honor her memory and keep the conversation alive.